Amen. Amen. How many of you believe that His grace is sufficient? It's all we need. It is enough. So my question is, it is enough when you're in a nice, comfortable room and you're singing with friends. But is it enough whenever you're having to lay down your life for His name because of His grace? Is it sufficient for every need we have? Some of you were listening to Danny as he was talking, and right in the middle, when he said something about the total cost of the storm and how it impacted us financially, he said $175,000, and there was this boom. Some of you think Danny was smart enough to coordinate that and try to make that happen. That's not the case. No, he's smart enough. He could do it. You've probably heard it more than once, and you're going to hear it through this message. That is the sound to remind us. Every 5 minutes in this world, a Christian dies for Jesus Christ. Every 5 minutes. Now, that's how it would average out over time of a year. We don't think about that. So hopefully when you hear that sound, it's a reminder there's a cost to believe. Belief is not just a head thing, it's a life thing, it's a heart thing, and it will take you places where there's a cost. And the scripture today is really about that. I wish I had known all the things that, the call involved in following Christ. I know this morning, if you have desire, we have a meeting coming up after this service at 12:45 in the choir room, which is directly behind me. Just out of the room, you go out and go around. For anyone who feels like God may be calling you to a vocation of ministry, a career of ministry, and we just want to talk, and we've got some ideas of how God may want us to help and steward you. Now, all of us are called, but there are those that are called to a specific career path that is ministry as a vocation. I know that for me, I have never had to suffer much for Jesus. I've never given up much. As a kid, I gave up Sunday nights watching Disney at 6 o'clock because it interrupted church on Sunday night. My friends were all talking about that program and back many, many years ago. And I remember thinking, wow, I don't ever get to see Disney, so I got to go to church. Or I can remember missing other things. But when I think about it, in the grand scheme of things, I've given up nothing. And so the question is, would I? Would I be willing to pay the cost? The reason I love that song, God's Glorious Grace, it has that line in it that says, I'm undeserving, but you are high and worthy. Say that with me. I am undeserving, but you are high and worthy. I pray you would always find Him worthy of anything you would have to go through. Even if it's embarrassment, there it is. Right on cue, 5 minutes. Even if it's embarrassment on social media, even if it's a little ridicule at school or at work, would we? Well, the man we're gonna meet, John the Baptist, is a story out of the Gospel of Mark that kind of gets dropped down into the narrative. And it's called a Markan sandwich. That's what they call it. Because Mark has a tendency to do that. He'll interrupt what he's telling you about in order to tell you something. And usually it's to kind of illustrate or to give a little significance to it. So what did we talk about last week? Well, in chapter 6, we were verse 7, and we read down through verse 13. We were talking about how He sent the disciples out. Verse 30 is when He tells you how it went. He gives you the little report from the mission trip. But in between there, He takes us back to a moment with John the Baptist. I believe because He wants to illustrate the cost of following. It cost John the Baptist literally his head. So here is what Mark writes. I'm going to pick it up in verse 14. King Herod heard of it, for Jesus' name had become known. Some said, John the Baptist has been raised from the dead, And that's why these miraculous powers are at work in him. But others said, no, he's Elijah. And others said, he's a prophet, like one of the prophets of old. But when Herod heard it, he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised. Now let's just pause there for a moment. I know two things that this teaches me, what we're going to read today, what it teaches me about the cost. I believe for every one of us who follow Christ, who take a stand for Jesus, you can expect these two things. Number one, you're going to be misunderstood. You just need to know you're going to be misunderstood. They didn't know who Jesus was. The whole issue of who is this is a point to the fact that Jesus was confusing people. They couldn't figure out who he was. He still confuses people. Your friends are confused at you. The time you spend at church, the money you give to church, the way you talk about Jesus, the way you pray. Trust me, you're misunderstood because they misunderstood Jesus. John the Baptist was misunderstood. So it's just a part of the fabric of who we are when we are Christ followers. They thought he was Elijah. They thought he was a prophet. Today, if you ask a Muslim friend, do you believe in Jesus? They'll say, yeah. Well, who was Jesus? And they'll say, oh, he was a great prophet. So all this confusion, it still exists. It's still there. But notice something, Herod thought Jesus was John the Baptist come back from the dead. And the reason is because he was the one that had the order him to be beheaded. So what Mark does now is he does a little time warp. He's now going back in the memory of Herod, and he takes you back to that story. So don't get confused trying to read this chronologically because it doesn't follow. It's like you're watching a movie, and all of a sudden there's a scene of somebody remembering something or a dream. So that's kind of what he's doing. So what was it that this was a memory of? A king by the name of Herod. And Herod's ordered to have John the Baptist beheaded. Why? Because John the Baptist spoke truth. So read on with me. For it was Herod who had sent and seized John and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because he had married her. Hang on to that thought. We'll be back there. For John had been saying to Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. And Herodias had a grudge against him and wanted to put him to death, but she could not, for Herod feared John. Knowing that he was a righteous man and a holy man, he kept him safe. And when he heard him, he was greatly perplexed. And yet, he heard him gladly. There's actually evidence that that word gladly may be the word often, as if John the Baptist was often summoned to King Herod to listen. So who is King Herod? What is this about? We all know King Herod. I don't mean the historical figure. I mean people in the world today that are just like him. Okay? And I'll show you what I mean by that. The Herodian family was a messed up family. I mean, Herod, it started with Herod the Great, the one who was in charge over all the region when Jesus was born. When he died, he gave it to his 4 sons, and it was a disaster. This is one of the sons, Herod Antipas. You think keeping up with the Kardashians is crazy. You ought to try the Herodian family. Let me show you the family tree. This is actually, you'll find this, Google Images, the Herod's family tree. Look at this. It's the most confusing thing you've ever seen. I mean, that looks like some of your family reunions. You're used to it, but it is crazy. Herod the Great, the father of this guy, had 10 wives. He killed 2 of them. He had a bunch of sons, and he killed 3 of them. So it is a chocolate mess when you get to the Herod family because there's intermarriage. There's all kind of stuff going on. This is the son. This one's mother happened to be a Samaritan woman. So you know that they didn't like him. His region was Galilee. Okay, the northern part around the Sea of Galilee, that was the region of this Herod Antipas. He was not liked for many reasons, but there was one in particular. He made Jews live places they didn't want to live. He forced people to live in certain places. If you've ever been over there and you visited the Holy Land, you probably went to the Sea of Galilee. If you went to the Sea of Galilee, you stayed in a town called Tiberias. It's a beautiful little city right on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. Do you know who built that town? Who started that little place? This Herod Antipas. He wanted to start a city and build a city in honor of Tiberius back in Rome. So basically, he said, I want to honor Tiberius, so he builds a city. The only problem is he built it on a cemetery. And he forced Jews to live there. According to Levitical law, you can't walk in a cemetery. You can't come into contact with dead people. So how are Jews going to live there? They were forced to live there. So everything he's doing creates this incredible animosity. I mean, he was probably just as pagan as his father. His father, one time Caesar Augustus, who was the Caesar of Rome, made a comment, it would be better to be Herod's pig than his son. So that gives you a little clue of how family-oriented this group was, all right? So here's Herod Antipas. Who does he marry? He marries his brother's wife. That's a little strange. You know what else? She was his niece. Okay, it's way complicated. He's married to his niece. He's married his brother's wife. So what does John the Baptist do? John the Baptist says, that's not right. I believe he had a relationship with Herod. I think he said, Herod, that's not right. You have violated Levitical law. Well, it didn't bother Herod that much, but Herod's wife took offense. So now Herod is protecting John the Baptist from his wife. She's ready to kill him. So guys, how many of you have had to protect one of your friends from your wife? Just go ahead, let's get a witness. You know what I'm talking about. So he's trying to protect her from this woman. She wants him dead. So I want to show you, in spite of the fact that Herod was messed up, came from a messed up family, was perplexed, confused, I want to show you how much he honored and revered John the Baptist. Go back to that text. Verse 20, for Herod feared John. You got to be kidding me. One of the Herods who's in charge, who has money, who has power, and he fears John the Baptist? Yes. And the word fear is a sense of awe and respect. Knowing that he was a righteous and holy man. Hold on. You mean Herod, a pagan man, actually thought John the Baptist was a righteous and holy man? Yeah. Isn't that interesting? Now watch this. And he kept him safe. He hid him. A lot of people believe he took him in the palace. And he gave him a place to stay before he imprisoned him. And said, you better stay here or my wife's going to kill you, so just stay here. When he heard him, he was greatly perplexed. That's a word that means he was just confused and intrigued, is one way I've seen it translated. And yet he heard him gladly, or he heard him often. So here's the lesson. When you stand for something, even those who are not on that same side with you, they respect you. There is a reverence, there's a sense that yes, you're misunderstood, but at least there is a sense that you are different. God is with you. I'm convinced that what this is teaching us is that in America today, look, stand for something. Believe what the Scripture teaches. Believe what Jesus calls us to believe. But don't force people because God's hand is on you and it's evident to them. Don't argue. Don't debate. Jesus said that last week. What do? You live your faith. And you live it in such a way that even a king like Herod, who had no faith, who was pagan to the core, saw that John was a godly and a righteous man. I believe whenever you walk with Jesus, the world knows it. I think people know it. Now, it doesn't mean they're going to agree with you. It doesn't mean they're going to like you. But I think they know it, and God uses you as a great witness. You never know the opportunity that you will have when you stand for what you believe and you stand for Jesus Christ. Now, doing it in a way that is godly, doing it in a way that's gracious, not in an obnoxious, being a jerk kind of way. stand for Jesus, and you will be misunderstood, but you will, I believe, be honored. The second thing that happened, that moment came when he was persecuted. No longer could the king keep him safe. No longer could he hide him in the palace. Because what happened? Well, according to the next verse, there's a party. And at the party, something happened that could not be changed. Verse 21, but an opportunity came when Herod on his birthday gave a banquet for his nobles and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. For when Herodias' daughter came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his guest. And the king said to the girl, ask me for whatever you wish and I'll give it to you. And he vowed to her, whatever you ask me, I'll give it to you up to half of my kingdom. And she went out and said to her mother, what should I ask? So there comes a moment when the persecution could not be stopped. There always comes that moment. It's coming. In this story, Herod has a party for himself. Did you catch that? It was his birthday. So he's going to have a party. He's going to invite all the leading men of Galilee. He's going to have all these noble and dignitaries and all these folks. And they have entertainment. And you know who the entertainment is? His stepdaughter. She's 15 years old. She is literally around the age of 15. Her name is Salome. She comes in where it's all guys. Mom's not in the room. No woman is in the room. We know that's how the kings would celebrate and party. She comes in the room and she dances. Now, I just think the safest way for me to say this, she wasn't line dancing. She wasn't square dancing. It was as provocative, it was as bad as it can be. And she did it, why? Because the men loved it. He was so moved, he looked at her and said, I'll give you anything you ask. Up to half of my kingdom I'll give you. He made a vow in front of all these guys. I'll give you anything you ask. Well, the 15-year-old girl doesn't know what to ask for. So she goes and asks Mama. I mean, come on, you could have asked for an iPhone 10. I mean, there's a lot of things that would be really, really simple. She doesn't know. She goes and asks Mama. And what does Mama do? Herodias, who's had a grudge against this guy, who has been the one who's going to punish him, she said, I want you to go back and you ask for the head of that prophet. You ask for the head of the man who said it wasn't lawful to be married to you, to the king. You ask for his head on a platter. And so the rest of the story is she goes back, she tells the king, I want the head of John the Baptist on a platter. So you know what he has to do? He has to do it. He made a vow. The king was exceedingly sorry. You see that in verse 26? Because of his oath. I believe he was. Because I believe the king I think he loved to listen to John the Baptist. I think there was something about John the Baptist that spoke into the heart of the king. So he was sorry that he'd made a vow. And for some reason, all of a sudden, the king gets a moral compass. All of a sudden, he gets real, interested in doing right and wrong. I think it was about pride. I think he didn't want to show himself weak to all of his men that were with him. And so he gives the order, go get the head of John the Baptist. They go and they cut the head of John the Baptist off. They bring it in a platter. The girl, 15-year-old girl, brings it to her mama and says, here, Mom, this is what you asked for. That's a pretty rough Mother's Day moment, isn't it? What a horrible story. So why in the world would Mark drop this in right here? Because he wants us to know there's a cost. Jesus said the world hated him, so it's going to hate us. He said, remember what I said. This is out of John 15:20. Remember the word I said to you? A servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they're going to persecute you. Guys, we live in a country where we've not had that kind of persecution. So you and I have gotten accustomed to being casual in our Christianity. We've kind of been culturally Christian. If you grew up in the South, like I did, oh my goodness, in some little towns, everybody's a Christian. Why? Well, I grew up here. That's why I'm a Christian. Everybody's a Christian. But see, 75% of the world population today live in a place where there's persecution. 75%. We're in the rare minority. 75% of them literally places persecution, and probably one of the number one groups, Christianity. You know how many are persecuted? 215 million Christians on this planet have to live in persecution. Some of them giving their life, some of them dying. And we don't think about that. There's a cost to believing. There's a cost to saying, Jesus, I'm going to follow you. When I think about the numbers of how many are persecuted, there's some countries that are really, really high on the list of persecution. And I want you to understand something. We should never take for granted religious freedom. You ought to, every chance you get, you ought to take a stand for the right to worship the way we want. And listen, not just your right. We got to stand for the right of everybody to worship the way they want to. Why? Because if they can't, then we can't. That sword cuts both ways. You have to be real careful in fighting for the right for people to worship like me. No, we fight for the right for people to worship any way they want. You know why? Because we believe Jesus wins every time if he's in the conversation. He wins every time. So I'm not afraid of all these other religions. I just want the freedom to worship because it's in that context we have the freedom to share Jesus. We have the freedom to talk about Christ. And I hope we never forget what that means to have that freedom, that we are free. But today, brothers and sisters in places on this earth, they're getting ready to die. They know they're marked as a Christian. Now, I believe we suffer persecution. I think there are forms of it for us. Let's be real honest. Some of you have not gotten a promotion because of your faith. Some of you have endured a ridicule because of your faith. I think some of you you've been in relationships that didn't go well because you were a believer and they weren't a believer. So yes, there are forms of persecution. There are things that are happening today in this country that worry me because they look ominous and they may be the beginning of what could be a wider way of being persecuted. You ask an actor today in Hollywood if being vocal about your faith in Jesus Christ gets you jobs. No, it doesn't. And I'll forever believe the reason Tim Tebow is not quarterbacking in the NFL today is because he is a radical follower of Jesus Christ. I think it happens. So my question is, when it does, are we prepared to stand? Because remember, the cost could be great. It could be your job. It could be, God forbid, your life. So when you read this, you get the impression that John lost. No, John didn't lose. John the Baptist won that day. We're talking about him today. We're talking about him. His life is an inspiration to people all over the world. Why? Because he lived his faith. He stood for something and he lived courageously. When I talk about John the Baptist, I think of the word courageous. He was courageous. He believed something and he stood for it. I believe if you and I will just learn to stand, we will gain more support and reverence and respect than we ever would if we're just all over the map. John believed something. You know that 93% of Americans believe that right or wrong is determined by what you think and what I think? In other words, it doesn't matter. You just believe whatever you want. Did you know that 74% of Americans say that they would steal from somebody if that person wouldn't miss it? There's no foundation. There's no sense of what is right and what this book says. Did you realize 25% of Americans, when asked what they'd do for $10 million, 25% of Americans said that they would leave their family for $10 million. 25% also said they'd prostitute themselves for 1 week for $10 million. You know what? Jesus is looking for people who can't be bought by the highest bidder, who are willing to say, Jesus, we are following you, and there is no buying us. I will stand for Christ. That's what John the Baptist was all about. He was persecuted to the point of death. And so we think, okay, is that what's coming for me, I don't know. I just know I'm going to walk the streets with John the Baptist one day. I'm going to see him one day. And I just know that what Jesus did for me, God's glorious grace, is worthy of my life. And it's also worthy of my death. Because no one's ever loved me like that. No one's ever done that for me. So John was faithful to the end. And the end, he won. Because you know what Jesus said about him? Look at this verse out of Matthew 11. This is one of my favorite verses about John the Baptist. Truly I say to you, among those born of women, there has arisen no one greater than John the Baptist. Let me tell you, you're not a loser when Jesus says you're the greatest that's ever been born. Am I right? I mean, he didn't lose. He won. And I know you're thinking, oh man, that's an awesome story, but I couldn't be John the Baptist. There's no way. I mean, my goodness. No, you can't, because he had a special role in history and he was the forerunner of Christ and told the world about Jesus. Nobody can have that same story. But you can be greater than him. And you're thinking, you're crazy. No, I'm not. I'm just telling you what Jesus said. Look at the rest of that verse. Read the rest of it. Is that not crazy? To think that we could be even greater than a man that was the greatest among women? The greatest man born of woman, John the Baptist. But then he says, yet the one who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he is. We can be that. I think that has to do with scope. I think it has to do with scale. I think it has to do with opportunity. You and I have even more opportunity than John the Baptist to change our world for Jesus. We have more opportunity to leave a legacy of faith. You and I have greater opportunity to make a difference in the world than John the Baptist did. So what about standing and saying, I am a follower. I've decided I will follow Jesus Christ. No matter what comes, I will be misunderstood. I will be persecuted. But that's okay, because he's worth it. You know what happens when this many people make that commitment? Things change. Hey, we have a brother and sister from Zambia, Africa, right here. I want them to stand up. I love Zambia, and I always will remember that special place. Welcome them all the way from Zambia, Africa. It's so good to see them. My daughter Hannah, sitting down here, and my family, that was the first place we went as a whole family in the bush of Africa, in the bush of Zambia, and we lived among the people and we shared the gospel there. You know what I learned about Zambia on that trip? I learned that whenever the guards and the military see a vehicle that has the word missionary, they would break out in a smile. And so I asked the missionary I was with, what is the deal with that? Man, they got these guns strapped over them, and they come up to the truck, and they smile. And he looked at me, and he said, the influence of David Livingstone. And I said, what do you mean? David Livingstone's heart is buried in Zambia, Africa. Literally cut out of his body, buried in Zambia. And because of his faithfulness to the gospel, there's something in the culture there that they still have respect for missionaries. Did you know that every city in Zambia, the name has been changed to African names, except one city in Zambia was not changed from an English name? Guess what name it is? Livingston. It's down at the bottom of the country. Livingston, a beautiful place. So tell me one person can't make a difference. One person who just says, I will follow Jesus Christ. If it takes me to my grave, I will follow Jesus Christ. You remember that chorus, I've decided to follow Jesus? You remember that? Singing that as a kid? Man, I've sung it so many times, I never knew the story behind it. Did you know where that came from? The wording from that came from India. After the Welsh revival, there was a missionary that went into northeast India, and while he was there in northeast India, he began to share the gospel, and there was a village that had never heard the gospel, and they were very, very violent people. And this father and mother and two boys from the village received Jesus. They said, we will follow Christ. When the chief heard about it, he brought him out in front of the whole village, and he said, you've got to renounce this new faith, this name that we've never heard. You've got to renounce it. And the father stepped up and said, no, I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back. With that, the chief gave the command, and the 2 boys were shot with arrows. As those 2 kids are lying there in the dirt, dying, the chief looks at him and says, you've got to renounce this faith. And the father said, no turning back. Though none go with me, I still will follow. And with that, the chief gave the order. The wife was shot. So now it's just the guy. And the chief said, I don't understand. You've got to renounce this faith. And he says, the cross before me, the world behind me. I have decided to follow Jesus Christ. They shot him. And the testimony of history of that village is that they all, because of this couple, wanted to know more about Jesus, and the chief himself became a follower of Jesus Christ, and the whole village became followers of Jesus Christ. All because of one man, one family, one mother, 2 boys who said, we have decided we are going to follow Jesus Christ. So yes, there's a cost, but it's worth it. So let me just say this as we close. One of the greatest Beatitudes of all the Beatitudes Jesus taught was one about when we get reviled for His name's sake. When we get persecuted for His name's sake. Now, He doesn't say when you get reviled because you're a jerk. He says when you get reviled for my name's sake. When you get persecuted for my name's sake. You know what Jesus said about you? Blessed are you. Blessed are you. For you're like the prophets who went before you. Blessed are you, for they hated me and persecuted me. They will persecute you. Blessed are you. So today, it's okay. Whatever comes our way, we've decided we will follow Jesus Christ. Let's go live for Him today. God bless you. Have a wonderful Lord's Day.